The story of Wales begins not with written records or the construction of mighty castles, but with the slow retreat of ice across a rugged landscape some 12,000 years ago. As the great glaciers withdrew northward at the end of the last ice age, the land that would become Wales gradually emerged from beneath its frozen mantle, taking roughly the shape we recognise today by around 7,000 years before the Common Era. The rising sea levels that accompanied this warming separated what had been connected landmasses, transforming the British Peninsula into an island and creating the Irish Sea that would forever define Wales's western boundary. Into this newly habitable terrain came small bands of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, numbering perhaps only a few hundred individuals across the entire region, who left behind scattered evidence of their presence in the form of worked flint tools and temporary encampments. If you enjoy these deep dives into history, please like and subscribe so you don't miss future stories. Also, drop a comment below letting us know where you're watching from. These earliest inhabitants of Wales lived lives of constant movement, following herds of deer and wild boar through forests of oak and hazel that now covered what had once been Arctic tundra. They crafted sophisticated stone tools from local flints, establishing seasonal camps along coastal areas and river valleys, where fish and shellfish could supplement their diet of game and gathered plants. The site at Nab Head in Pembrokeshire, dated to around 7000 BC, represents one of the earliest known Mesolithic settlements in Wales, while decorated pebbles discovered at Rhuddlan provide glimpses of the artistic sensibilities of these ancient peoples. At Aberfrau Bay on Anglesey, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of continuous habitation stretching back 9,000 years to a site called Ed Tryn Du, where thousands of Mesolithic flint tools and 2 stone axes were deposited over millennia, only to be covered centuries later by a Bronze Age burial mound. These hunter-gatherers knew the landscape intimately, understanding the seasonal movements of animals and the growth cycles of edible plants, with a sophistication that allowed them to thrive in an environment that would challenge modern survival experts. Yet long before even these Mesolithic peoples had arrived in Wales, the land had witnessed an even more ancient human presence. In 1823, a team exploring the Paviland Caves along the Gower Peninsula in South Wales made a discovery that would fundamentally alter our understanding of prehistoric Britain. Deep within one of these limestone caverns, they found a skeleton stained with red ochre, accompanied by fragments of ivory jewellery, mammoth bones, and seashells. Initially misidentified as the Red Lady of Paviland, the remains were actually those of a young man who had lived approximately 33,000 years ago during the Upper Paleolithic period, making this the oldest known ceremonial burial in Western Europe. The presence of such elaborate grave goods, including ivory br, ocellets and decorated rods, suggests that even at this early date, human communities possessed complex beliefs about death and the afterlife, as well as the technical skills necessary to work ivory and other difficult materials. The Paviland burial represents one of the few glimpses we have of life in Wales during the Paleolithic, when the climate would occasionally warm enough to allow human habitation before deteriorating again and forcing abandonment of the region. The transformation of Wales from a land of nomadic hunters to one of settled farmers began around 4,000 years before the Common Era, marking the transition to the Neolithic period. Archaeological evidence suggests that farming communities arrived in Wales already possessing knowledge of agriculture and animal husbandry, likely learned from continental sources. These Neolithic peoples brought with them domesticated cattle pigs and sheep, along with cultivated varieties of wheat and barley that fundamentally altered both the landscape and the human relationship with it. Pollen evidence from bogs and lake sediments reveals an accelerating pattern of forest clearance, as these early farmers burned and felled trees to create fields for their crops and pastures for their livestock. This environmental transformation was not merely incidental, but represented a conscious remaking of the Welsh landscape to suit human needs and desires. The Neolithic peoples of Wales left behind monuments that continue to dominate certain landscapes thousands of years after their construction. Chambered tombs, also known as dolmens or cromlechs, scatter across the Welsh countryside, with particularly impressive examples concentrated on the island of Anglesey. Bryn Celli Du, meaning the mound in the dark grove, stands as one of Wales's most famous Neolithic landmarks. A passage tomb carefully oriented so that the midsummer sunrise sends light down its corridor to illuminate the inner chamber for just a brief moment each year. This astronomical precision suggests a sophisticated understanding of celestial movements and indicates that these structures serve not merely as burial places, but as ceremonial centres intimately connected with agricultural cycles and seasonal celebrations. Nearby, Barclodiad I Gowras features elaborate spiral carvings on its interior stones, connecting it to a wider tradition of Neolithic art found across Ireland and Britain. The construction of these monuments required massive communal effort, with the capstone at Tinkinswood Burial Chamber in the Vale of Glamorgan weighing approximately 40 tons, making it likely the largest in Britain and necessitating the coordinated labour of hundreds of people working with nothing more than ropes, levers and human muscle. The archaeological evidence from these tombs reveals that Neolithic Welsh communities practiced complex mortuary rituals. At Tinkinswood, excavations uncovered the remains of at least 50 individuals along with pottery fragments suggesting that bodies were placed in the chambers over extended periods, perhaps generations, with the tombs serving as a communal ossuary for an entire community's ancestors. The act of gathering these bones together in sacred spaces indicates beliefs about the continued presence and power of the dead within the world of the living. The construction of these monuments also tells us something about Neolithic social organisation, suggesting communities capable of mobilising large labour forces and maintaining collective projects over years or even decades. The deliberate placement of many tombs on prominent ridges or hilltops, where they remain visible from great distances, indicates that these structures served as territorial markers proclaiming a community's connection to specific landscapes and their right to exploit the resources those lands contained. The Neolithic period also saw the development of specialised craft industries, with Wales emerging as a significant centre of stone axe production. At Penman Mawr, on the north coast near what is now Conwy, a massive axe factory operated, producing thousands of polished stone axe heads that have been found distributed across Wales and England as far as Yorkshire and the Midlands. The Graig factory took advantage of local outcrops of especially hard stone ideal for creating durable cutting edges, and the standardised forms of the axes suggest experienced craftspeople working within established traditions. The wide distribution of these axes indicates trade networks linking distant communities and the movement not just of objects but of ideas and technologies across considerable distances. The village near Llanfeddlw on Anglesey dated to around 4000 BC. With its wooden longhouses, represents potentially Wales's first true village settlement, showing the transition from mobile hunting camps to permanent agricultural communities. Around 2,500 years before the Common Era, Wales entered the Bronze Age with the appearance of the first metal tools, initially copper followed shortly by bronze and alloy, primarily of copper and tin, that proved far superior to stone for creating sharp, durable implements. The climate during the early Bronze Age is thought to have been warmer than today, allowing settlement and agriculture to extend into upland areas that are now bleak moorland. The Great Orme copper mine near Llandudno stands as one of the most remarkable Bronze Age industrial sites in Europe, with evidence of mining on a truly massive scale. Radiocarbon dating indicates that the most intensive exploitation occurred during the Middle Bronze Age, when miners dug an astonishing network of tunnels and galleries following copper-bearing veins deep into the mountain. The scale of operations at Great Orme was extraordinary, with modern excavations revealing that prehistoric miners removed hundreds of thousands of tons of rock to extract the copper ore using nothing more than stone hammers and bone tools. The copper from these mines appears to have been used in the production of bronze implements across a wide region, with chemical analysis linking Great Orme copper to artefacts found throughout Wales and beyond. The Bronze Age witnessed significant changes in burial practices, with the communal chambered tombs of the Neolithic giving way to individual burials in round barrows, often accompanied by grave goods that suggest emerging social hierarchies. The most spectacular Bronze Age find from Wales remains the mould gold cape, discovered in a burial mound at Bryn Mawr Elilion in Flintshire. This extraordinary object, fashioned from a single gold ingot and dated to between 1900 and 1600 BC, represents an incredible achievement of prehistoric metalworking. The cape, weighing 560 grams, features elaborate repoussé decoration with raised bosses and ribs that would have created a shimmering effect when worn. The amount of gold used and the exceptional craftsmanship required to create such an object indicates both access to significant wealth and the existence of highly skilled artisans capable of working with precious metals. The fact that this cape was buried with a single individual rather than placed in a communal tomb suggests the emergence of distinct social classes, with some individuals achieving status that set them apart from the general population. The Late Bronze Age, beginning around 1250 BC, saw deteriorating climatic conditions with increased rainfall and lower temperatures that may have driven populations from marginal upland areas back toward more fertile lowland zones. This period also witnessed the development of increasingly sophisticated bronze implements, with regional variations in tool styles, suggesting the emergence of distinct cultural groups. Archaeological evidence indicates that Wales during this period can be divided into several regions based on tool types. These areas show approximate correspondence to the territories that would later be occupied by the tribes the Romans encountered when they arrived in Wales more than a millennium later. The Ordovices inhabited mid to North Wales, and Anglesey, the Dee. Shangley occupied the northeast, the Demetai controlled the southwest, and the Silures dominated the southeast. This correlation between Bronze Age tool distribution patterns and later tribal territories suggests remarkable continuity in regional identities maintained across many generations. The transition to the Iron Age around 800 BC brought both new technologies and new defensive structures to Wales. Iron working techniques reached Britain from continental Europe, allowing the production of harder, more durable tools and weapons, though bronze continued to be used for decorative items and jewellery. The most visible legacy of the Iron Age in Wales remains the hundreds of hill forts that crown prominent peaks throughout the country. These fortified enclosures, ranging from small defended farmsteads to massive multi-valet structures covering dozens of acres, represent a significant investment of communal labour. Pendynas near Aberystwyth and Tre'r Siri on the Lane Peninsula stand among the most impressive examples, with massive stone walls and ditches defending elevated positions that command extensive views of surrounding territories. The construction of these hill forts has traditionally been interpreted as evidence of increasing warfare and social conflict during the Iron Age, though some scholars now suggest they may have served as much as status symbols and communal gathering places as purely defensive structures. The discovery of a remarkable cache of artefacts at Llyn Cerrig Bach on Anglesey in 1943 provided extraordinary insights into Iron Age Welsh culture. While preparing ground for a Royal Air Force base, workers uncovered a collection of over 150 items deliberately deposited in what had been a lake or bog. The cache included weapons such as swords and spearheads, along with chariot fittings, horse harnesses, slave chains, blacksmith's tools, and a beautifully decorated bronze plaque. Many of the items had been intentionally broken before deposition, suggesting they were votive offerings presented to deities in a sacred place. Similar ritual deposits have been found elsewhere in Wales, including at Llyn Ffor in the Rhondda Valley, where iron implements, including a sword spearhead and sickle, were discovered apparently offered to the gods during the transition from Bronze to Iron Age. These finds indicate sophisticated religious beliefs and suggest that certain natural features, particularly bodies of water, held special sacred significance for Iron Age peoples. The Celtic peoples who inhabited Wales during the later Iron Age developed a distinctive artistic tradition characterized by flowing curvilinear designs and stylized animal motifs. Bronze mirrors decorated with elaborate patterns, horse equipment featuring enamel inlay and torques of twisted gold, all demonstrate the technical sophistication and aesthetic sensibilities of Celtic craftspeople. The evidence from Wales suggests a society organized into tribal groups, each controlling specific territories with leadership, likely vested in warrior aristocrats, who demonstrated their status through ownership of fine weapons, horses, and imported luxury goods. The hill forts that dominated the landscape served as centers of power, where tribal leaders could gather followers, distribute wealth collected through Jachi tribute or raiding, and demonstrate their authority through conspicuous consumption and generous hospitality. Though we lack written records from this period, the archaeological evidence points to a complex hierarchical society with specialized craftspeople, long-distance trade connections, and shared cultural traditions that link the peoples of Wales with other Celtic populations across Britain and continental Europe. The arrival of Roman legions in Britain in 43 AD under Emperor Claudius would fundamentally alter the trajectory of Welsh history. The Roman conquest of what would become England proceeded relatively quickly, but the mountainous terrain of Wales and the fierce resistance of its tribes would require decades of brutal campaigning before Roman control could be established. The initial Roman presence along the Welsh borderlands, beginning around 48 AD, quickly escalated into sustained military operations as the legions encountered determined opposition from the native tribes. The Silures of southeastern Wales, described by the Roman historian Tacitus as a strong warlike people with swarthy faces and curly hair, emerged as particularly stubborn opponents of Roman expansion. Their assistance was initially led by Caratacus, a British chieftain who had fled westward after his tribal capital in southeastern England fell during the initial Roman invasion. Caratacus understood that the fragmented nature of British resistance played into Roman hands, and he worked to unite various Welsh tribes against the invaders. After several years of guerrilla warfare, he chose to make a stand in the territory of the Ordovices in 51 AD. The battle that followed demonstrated both the tactical skill of the Britons and the overwhelming military superiority of the Roman legions. Tacitus records that Caratacus selected his ground, carefully choosing a position where steep approaches and hasty fortifications would negate some of the Roman advantages. He rode among his warriors before the battle, reminding them that this day would either restore their freedom or consign them to eternal slavery. Despite their courage and the strength of their position, the Welsh, each warriors could not withstand the disciplined advance of the Roman heavy infantry. The legions pressed forward under a hail of stones and javelins, overcoming the defensive works and routing the tribal army. Caratacus escaped the battlefield, but in a decision that would seal his fate, he fled to the Brigantes tribe in northern England, hoping to find refuge with their queen Cartimandua. The queen, however, calculated that her own people's survival depended on maintaining good relations with Rome, and she betrayed Caratacus to the Roman authorities. The captured chieftain was taken to Rome in chains, where he was paraded before Emperor Claudius and the Roman populace. According to Tacitus, Caratacus maintained his dignity even in defeat, addressing the emperor directly. When he saw the grand buildings and opulent wealth of Rome, he reportedly asked why a people with such magnificent possessions still coveted the poor huts of the Britons. Claudius was sufficiently impressed by this display of courage and composure that he spared Caratacus's life, allowing him to live out his days in honourable captivity in Rome, rather than facing execution as was customary for defeated enemies. The capture of Caratacus represented a significant propaganda victory for the Romans, but it did not end Welsh resistance to Roman rule. The Silures continued their fierce opposition under other leaders, and it would take another 30 years of campaigning before the Romans could claim even nominal control over southern Wales. The resistance was so determined that successive Roman governors launched repeated military expeditions into Welsh territory, often with mixed success. In 60 or 61 AD, the Roman governor Suetonius Paulinus led a major assault on the island of Anglesey, which had become a stronghold of Druidic resistance to Roman rule. The Druids represented the religious and intellectual elite of Celtic Britain, and their opposition to Rome was both ideological and practical, as they encouraged native populations to resist the invaders. Tacitus provides a vivid, if perhaps somewhat embellished, account of the Assos LT on Anglesey, describing how Roman soldiers confronted not only armed warriors, but also women dressed in black, running among the ranks like furies, and Druids raising their hands to heaven, calling down curses upon the invaders. The Roman troops initially hesitated, frightened by this unfamiliar spectacle, but eventually overcame their fear and attacked. The assault resulted in a massacre, with the Roman forces systematically destroying the sacred groves where the Druids had performed their rituals. The subjugation of Wales required the construction of an extensive network of military installations to control the conquered territories and suppress any renewed resistance. Roman military occupation of Wales centered on a chain of forts connected by roads that allowed rapid movement of troops and supplies. The fortress at Dover, which would later become Chester, served as the headquarters for the 20th Legion and controlled northern Wales, while Isca Silurum, later known as Caerleon, on the banks of the River Usk, housed the 2nd Augustan Legion and dominated the south. Caerleon developed into one of the most important Roman military installations in Britain, capable of housing over 5,000 legionaries. Archaeological excavations at the site have revealed extensive barracks workshops, bathhouses, and a stone amphitheatre that could accommodate the entire garrison for training exercises and entertainment. The amphitheatre at Caerleon is the only fully excavated Roman amphitheatre in Britain and provides extraordinary insights into the recreational activities of the legions stationed on this remote frontier. The construction of Roman forts and roads represented a massive engineering undertaking that transformed the Welsh landscape. Engineers surveyed routes through difficult terrain, bridges spanned rivers, and construction crews built all-weather roads connecting the network of military installations. The road systems served not only military purposes, but also facilitated the movement of goods and ideas, creating connections between previously isolated communities. Around the major fortresses, civilian settlements or cannae developed as traders, craftspeople, and the unofficial families of soldiers established businesses to serve the garrison. These settlements introduced Roman urban culture to Wales, with markets, bathhouses, and temples serving the mixed populations of Romans and Romanized Britons who inhabited them. Despite the Roman military presence and nearly 3.5 centuries of nominal Roman rule, much of Wales remained only superficially Romanized. Unlike southeastern England, where Roman culture deeply influenced the native population, creating a hybrid Romano-British society, the mountainous terrain of Wales and the strength of indigenous cultural traditions meant that Roman influence remained largely confined to the lowlands and areas near military installations. Only in southeastern Wales, particularly around Caerwent and Carmarthen, did true Romano-British towns develop with the architecture, civic institutions, and urban culture characteristic of Roman civilization. Caerwent, ancient Venta Silurum, became the civitas capital of the Silures tribe, and archaeological evidence suggests it functioned as a genuine Roman town, complete with forum basilica bathhouses and comfortable townhouses decorated with mosaics. The construction of Caerwent represented an attempt to integrate the conquered Silures into Roman administration by providing them with the institutions of Roman urban life. The Demetae in southwestern Wales provide an interesting case study in Roman provincial policy. This tribe had offered little resistance to Roman conquest, and in return they received relatively favourable treatment. Their capital at Moridunum, which would later become Carmarthen, was granted civitas status, making it an administrative centre for the tribe. The Romans maintained only a light military presence in Demetai territory, suggesting they viewed the tribe as generally compliant. This pattern of differential treatment, rewarding cooperative tribes while maintaining heavy military control over restive populations, characterised Roman policy throughout Wales. In areas where resistance had been fierce, such as the territories of the Silures and Ordovices military occupation, remained intensive with forts and fortlets maintaining surveillance over potentially hostile populations. The Roman period in Wales was characterised by extensive exploitation of natural resources, particularly minerals. The Romans employed their engineering expertise to extract gold, copper, lead, zinc, and silver from Welsh deposits, with operations at Dolaucothi in Carmarthenshire, representing the largest known Roman gold mine in Britain. The extensive workings at Dolaucothi included elaborate systems of aqueducts to bring water from distant sources for hydraulic mining techniques that used high-pressure water to break down ore-bearing rock faces. Underground galleries extended deep into the mountainside, following gold-bearing veins, with Roman miners working in cramped, dangerous conditions to extract the precious metal. The scale of operations at Dolaucothi was enormous, and the site continued to be worked sporadically long after the Romans departed. The beginning of the end for Roman Wales came in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, as the Western Roman Empire faced increasing pressures from Germanic invasions, political instability, and economic decline. Roman military units were progressively withdrawn from Britain to defend more vital territories on the continent, and by 383 AD, the military garrison of Wales had been largely abandoned. The traditional date given for the final Roman departure from Britain is 410 AD, when the Emperor Honorius supposedly sent letters to the cities of Britain instructing them to see to their own defence. In Wales, where Roman rule had always been primarily military in nature, the departure of the legions meant the effective end of Roman authority. In areas like South, Eastern Wales, where Roman culture had taken deeper root, some continuity persisted with Romano-British elites maintaining Roman administrative practices, and urban life continuing in places like Caerwent well into the 6th century. Archaeological evidence suggests that early Christian worship was established in Caerwent by the late 5th century, with the town possibly having a bishop and monastery during the 6th century. The departure of the Romans created a power vacuum in Wales that was filled by the emergence of native kingdoms that would shape Welsh history for the next 8 centuries. The period from approximately 450 to 1100 AD, known as the Early Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, saw the gradual consolidation of power into increasingly hierarchical kingdoms that competed for supremacy, while simultaneously defending Welsh territories against external threats. The formation of these kingdoms represented both a return to pre-Roman political patterns and an adaptation to new realities, including the arrival of Irish settlers in Western Wales, the increasing pressure from Anglo-Saxon kingdoms expanding westward, and internal dynastic conflicts that would characterise medieval Welsh polity, etc. According to tradition recorded in later genealogies and chronicles, the Kingdom of Gwynedd in northwestern Wales was founded by Cwneda, a leader who migrated southward from Mano Gododin in what is now southern Scotland around the mid-5th century. The traditional account states that Cwneda came with his sons and warband to expel Irish settlers, known as the Scoti, who had established themselves in northern Wales during the later Roman period. While the historicity of Cwneda himself remains debated among scholars, there is archaeological and linguistic evidence for Irish presence in Wales during this period. Ogham inscriptions and early Irish writing system have been found on stones in Wales, particularly in the southwest, suggesting significant Irish cultural influence. The expulsion, or absorption, of these Irish populations would have been a gradual process taking place over several generations, rather than a single dramatic military campaign. Cunedda's descendants established a dynasty that would rule Gwynedd for centuries, claiming descent that connected them to both ancient British royal lines and supposedly back to the legendary founder, Brutus of Troy. The kingdom of Gwynedd, with its heartland in Snowdonia, and the fertile island of Anglesey, which served as its breadbasket, emerged as one of the most powerful and enduring Welsh kingdoms. Its geographical position, with mountains providing natural defences and the sea offering both protection and opportunities for maritime trade, gave Gwynedd significant strategic advantages. The rulers of Gwynedd styled themselves as paramount kings, claiming overlordship not just over their immediate territories, but over other Welsh rulers as well. This claim would be a source of both strength and conflict, as it led to frequent wars with other Welsh kingdoms that resented Gwynedd's pretensions to superiority. One of the earliest well-documented kings of Gwynedd was Maelgwn Hir, or Maelgwn the Tall, who ruled during the mid-6th century and appears in contemporary sources, including the writings of the British monk Gildas. In his work, De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae, or On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain, Gildas castigates 5 British kings for their various sins, and Maelgwn receives particular condemnation. Gildas calls him the Dragon of the Island and describes him as the most powerful of the 5 kings, suggesting that Gwynedd, under Maelgwn's rule, had achieved a position of dominance among the British kingdoms. However, Gildas also accuses Maelgwn of murder tyranny and various moral failings, painting a picture of a powerful but deeply flawed ruler who, despite his political success, had strayed from Christian virtue. Traditional accounts credit Maelgwn with hosting the first Eisteddfod, a cultural festival of poetry and music, though this attribution is likely legendary. What is clear from the sources is that Gwynedd under Maelgwn was wealthy, powerful, and culturally sophisticated, maintaining connections with other British kingdoms, and perhaps even with continental Europe. The 6th and 7th centuries saw the fragmentation of British territory as Anglo-Saxon kingdoms expanded westward, progressively separating the Britons of Wales from their kinfolk in what is now northern England and southwestern England. The Battle of Dereham near Gloucester in 577 resulted in the separation of the Britons in Cornwall from those in Wales, while the Battle of Chester in 616 completed the isolation of Wales from the northern British kingdoms. These battles were not merely military defeats, but represented permanent territorial losses that confined the Welsh to an increasingly restricted area. The Anglo-Saxon advance also severed ancient trading routes and disrupted cultural connections that had linked British kingdoms across considerable distances. The construction of Offa's Dyke in the late 8th century, a massive earthwork running roughly north to south along the Welsh border, represented a physical demarcation of the boundary between Welsh and English territories, though its precise purpose, whether primarily defensive, symbolic, or administrative, remains debated by scholars. During this period, several other kingdoms emerged alongside Gwynedd to compete for power and influence in Wales. In the southwest, the Kingdom of Dyfed developed with a complex history involving Irish settlement and influence. The ruling dynasty of Dyfed appears to have been at least partially of Irish origin, and the region maintained cultural and perhaps political connections with Ireland for centuries. Further east, the Kingdom of Ceredigion occupied the western coast of what is now mid-Wales, while inland, the Kingdom of Powys controlled the upper reaches of the Severn Valley and borderlands with Mercia. In the southeast, the kingdoms of Gwent and Glywysing would eventually merge to form Morgan WG, showing how territorial boundaries remained fluid throughout this period. The political map of early medieval Wales was complex and constantly shifting, with kingdoms expanding and contracting through conquest, marriage, inheritance, and warfare. The relationship between these Welsh kingdoms was characterised by both cooperation and conflict. Welsh kings frequently made war upon each other, competing for territory, tribute, and prestige, with family relationships offering no guarantee of peace, as brothers, cousins, and uncles fought for dominance. At the same time, external threats, particularly from the expanding Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Mercia and Northumbria, sometimes forced temporary alliances among Welsh rulers. The Welsh also maintained complex relationships with these Anglo-Saxon neighbours, sometimes serving as allies against other English kingdoms, while at other times resisting English expansion into Welsh territories. The poem Why Gododin, traditionally attributed to the poet Aneurin, describes a raid by British warriors from the north against the Angles at Cattraeth and includes warriors from Wales fighting alongside their northern kinsmen, suggesting continued military cooperation even after territorial separation. The 8th and 9th centuries brought new challenges to Wales in the form of Viking raids. Norse and Danish raiders began attacking coastal settlements and monasteries seeking plunder slaves and eventually permanent settlement. The Vikings established bases in Ireland and the Isle of Man, from which they could launch raids against the Welsh coast. Anglesey, with its rich agricultural land and wealthy monasteries, proved particularly attractive to Viking raiders, who attacked the island repeatedly during this period. These raids disrupted Welsh society and economy, causing significant damage to monasteries which served as centres of learning and culture, as well as religion. The Viking threat would remain a constant concern for Welsh rulers throughout the 9th and 10th centuries, requiring them to develop new defensive strategies and sometimes forcing them into uneasy alliances with English kings against the common Scandinavian enemy. Despite these challenges, the 9th century saw the emergence of a Welsh king who came closer than any previous ruler to uniting Wales under a single authority. Rhodri Mawr, or Rhodri the Great, ruled Gwynedd from 844 until his death in 878. Through a combination of inheritance, marriage and conquest, Rhodri extended his authority over Powys and Saesylwg, creating a realm that encompassed much of Wales. His success in defeating Viking raiders, including a notable victory in which he killed the Danish chieftain Gorm, earned him widespread respect and enhanced his prestige among the Welsh. When Rhodri died in battle against the Mercians in 878, his extensive territories were divided among his sons according to Welsh inheritance customs. This partition would create enduring political divisions as Rhodri's descendants competed for supremacy with his grandson Hywel Deda, or Hywel the Good, emerging as another significant unifying figure in the following century. Hywel Dda, who died around 950, managed to bring much of Wales under his control, and is particularly remembered for his role in codifying Welsh law. The traditional account holds that Hywel called a great assembly at Whitland in the southwest, where Welsh legal customs and precedents were systematically organised and written down, creating a body of law that would remain in force in Wales for centuries. The laws of Hywel Dda, as they became known, differed in significant ways from English common law, particularly in matters of property inheritance and the treatment of women who enjoyed greater rights under Welsh law than under contemporary English legal systems. Whether Hywel actually created this legal code or merely presided over its codification remains debated, but the association of his name with Welsh law gave it authority and legitimacy for generations of Welsh people. Hywel also maintained peaceful relations with the English, recognising the growing power of the English kingdom and understanding that direct confrontation would likely prove disastrous for Wales. He regularly attended the English court, paid homage to English kings, and even appeared on English charters, demonstrating his willingness to work within the political realities of the time. This policy of accommodation with England while maintaining Welsh autonomy in internal affairs represented a pragmatic approach to the challenges facing Welsh rulers. Some later Welsh nationalists would criticise Hywel for his submissive relationship with England, but his policy arguably preserved Welsh independence at a time when outright resistance might have led to earlier conquest and absorption into the English kingdom. After Hywel's death in 950, his realm once again fragmented as his sons and grandsons competed for power. The pattern of territorial unification, followed by fragmentation upon a ruler's death, would characterise Welsh politics throughout the medieval period, reflecting both the strength of Welsh inheritance customs that divided property among all male heirs and the fundamental difficulty of maintaining centralised authority across Wales's difficult terrain. The constant warfare between Welsh kingdoms and the resulting instability would ultimately prove one of Wales's greatest weaknesses in resisting external conquest, as Welsh rulers often seemed more concerned with fighting each other than with presenting a united front against English encroachment. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 brought dramatic new challenges to Wales. William the Conqueror initially focused his attention on consolidating control over England and showed little immediate interest in conquering Wales. However, the establishment of three powerful earldoms along the Welsh border, Chester, Shrewsbury and Hereford, created the conditions for gradual Norman penetration into Welsh territories. The Norman lords appointed to these border earldoms were given extraordinary autonomy to pursue their own expansion into Wales, and they quickly began pushing westward, creating what became known as the Welsh Marches. These marcher lordships operated under the custom of the March, which granted the lords extensive powers, including the right to wage private war-build castles and dispense justice according to their own courts, rather than royal English law. The Normans brought sophisticated castle-building technology to Wales, constructing initially wooden motte and bailey fortifications that could be erected quickly to secure conquered territories. The conquest proceeded unevenly, with the Normans achieving their greatest early successes in southern Wales, particularly in Gwent and along the southern coast. In 1067, William Fitz-Osbern, Earl of Hereford, overran the Kingdom of Gwent, establishing Norman control over southeastern Wales. The killing of the Welsh prince Bleddyn ap Cynfyn in 1075 created a power vacuum that the Normans quickly exploited, seizing territories in northern and central Wales. By the 1080s, Norman forces had penetrated deep into Welsh territories, establishing lordships and constructing castles to secure their conquests. However, Welsh resistance soon coalesced under determined leaders who recognized the existential threat posed by Norman expansion. In 1094, a general Welsh revolt broke out that succeeded in reversing many Norman gains. Gruffydd ap Cynan, who would rule Gwynedd for over 50 years, led the resistance in the north, while other Welsh princes organised opposition in their respective territories. The Welsh employed guerrilla tactics using their knowledge of local terrain to ambush Norman forces and besiege isolated castles. The revolt demonstrated that while the Normans could conquer Welsh territories, they would face enormous difficulties in holding them against determined opposition. Over the following decades, a rough equilibrium emerged with the Normans controlling lowland areas, particularly in the south and east, where they could build castles and establish agricultural settlements, while Welsh princes maintained control over the mountainous interior. The 12th century saw the emergence of increasingly powerful Welsh princes who challenged both Norman expansion and English royal authority. Owain Gwynedd, who ruled from 1137 to 1170, built Gwynedd into a formidable power capable of not only defending its territories, but also expanding at the expense of both Norman lords and rival Welsh kingdoms. Owain allied with Gruffydd ap Rhys of Deheubarth, and together they won a significant victory over the Normans at the Battle of Crug Mawr in 1136, demonstrating that Welsh forces could defeat Norman armies in pitched battle when the terrain favoured them. The period of civil war in England, known as the Anarchy, when King Stephen and Empress Matilda fought for the English throne, allowed Welsh princes to recover lost territories, as the Norman lords focused on the conflict in England rather than maintaining their positions in Wales. In southern Wales, Rhys ap Gruffydd, known as the Lord Rhys, emerged as the dominant figure in the second half of the 12th century. After initially resisting English expansion, Rhys came to an accommodation with King Henry II in 1171, whereby he agreed to pay tribute and was confirmed in his conquests and recognised as Justiciar of South Wales. This arrangement allowed Rhys to consolidate his power in Deheubarth while acknowledging nominal English overlordship. Rhys proved to be an effective ruler and cultural patron, hosting at his court at Cardigan. what is generally regarded as the first recorded Eisteddfod in 1176, bringing together poets, musicians and performers from across Wales in a celebration of Welsh culture and literary achievement. The most significant of all Welsh medieval rulers was Llywelyn ap Iorwerth, known as Llywelyn the Great or Llywelyn IV. Llywelyn emerged victorious from the succession struggles that followed Owain Gwyned's death, and by 1200 had established himself as sole ruler of Gwynedd. Over the following 4 decades, he would transform Gwynedd into the dominant power in Wales, gradually extending his authority over most of the country through a combination of military conquest, strategic marriages, and skillful diplomacy. Llywelyn understood that successful resistance to English expansion required Welsh unity, and he worked systematically to bring other Welsh princes under his overlordship. He also navigated the treacherous waters of English politics, maintaining generally good relations with King John, despite occasional conflicts, and then skillfully managing his relationship with John's son, Henry III. Llywelyn's grandson, Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, continued and expanded his grandfather's work, attempting to create a unified Welsh principality under his rule. By the Treaty of Montgomery in 1267, King Henry III recognised Llywelyn as Prince of Wales, a title that formally acknowledged his paramountcy over the other Welsh princes. This represented the high watermark of Welsh political independence, with a native Welsh prince controlling most of Wales and receiving recognition of his status from the English crown. However, this achievement proved short-lived, as the accession of Edward I to the English throne in 1272 brought to power a king determined to reduce Wales to complete submission. Edward I approached the subjugation of Wales with the systematic thoroughness that characterised his entire reign. When Llywelyn refused to perform homage and continued to clash with Marcher lords, Edward launched a massive military campaign in 1277. The English strategy combined land and sea operations, with Edward leading a large army into northern Wales, while supply ships from the Cinque ports provided logistical support. Importantly, Edward also recruited Welsh troops from southern Wales, exploiting divisions among the Welsh princes, many of whom resented Llywelyn's overlordship. The campaign never came to a major battle, as Llywelyn quickly recognised that his position was hopeless faced with an English army of 15,000, including 9,000 Welshmen. The Treaty of Aberconwy in November 1277 stripped Llywelyn of most of his conquests, leaving him only Western Gwynedd, though he was allowed to retain the title Prince of Wales. The settlement proved unstable, and in 1282 war broke out again, this time triggered by a rebellion led by Llywelyn's brother Dafydd. What began as a revolt quickly escalated into a national uprising, with Welsh princes across the country joining the resistance. Edward responded with overwhelming force, launching a 3-pronged invasion, with armies advancing from Chester in the north, the Marches in central Wales, and from the south. The turning point came in December 1282, when Llywelyn was killed in a minor skirmish at Orwyn Bridge near Builth Wells. His death shattered Welsh resistance, and though his brother Dafydd continued fighting for several more months, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Dafydd was captured in June 1283, and Edward showed no mercy. At Shrewsbury on October 3rd, 1283, Dafydd became the first person to be hanged, drawn and quartered for high treason, establishing a precedent for this horrific form of execution that would be used against enemies of the English crown for centuries to come. Edward's conquest of Wales was consolidated through one of the most impressive castle-building programs in medieval Europe. Between 1277 and 1295, Edward constructed or substantially rebuilt 10 major castles, forming a ring of iron around Gwynedd. These fortifications, including the magnificent castles at Caernarfon, Conwy Harlech and Beaumaris, represented the cutting edge of military architecture, combining concentric walls with sophisticated defensive features that made them virtually impregnable to medieval siege techniques. The castles were built not merely as military installations, but as symbols of English power designed to overawe the conquered Welsh population and demonstrate the futility of resistance. The construction required enormous resources, both financial and human, with Edward spending over £80,000 on his Welsh castles, more than his annual revenue from England. Thousands of labourers were conscripted from across England and Wales to work on the projects under the direction of Master James of St George, the greatest military engineer of the age. Alongside the castles, Edward established English boroughs or fortified towns that were planted throughout Wales as centres of English colonisation and administration. These new towns were populated with English settlers who received special privileges and monopolies over trade, excluding the Welsh from commercial activities in their own country. The Welsh were forbidden from bearing arms within borough walls or owning property in the English towns, creating a system of ethnic segregation and economic discrimination. The Statute of Rhuddlan in 1284 reorganised Welsh governance, imposing English administrative structures and English law, while permitting some elements of Welsh law to continue in civil matters. Wales was divided into shires on the English model, and representatives from Wales would eventually be summoned to the English Parliament, though the number of Welsh MPs remained small, and they had little real influence. Edward's conquest might have marked the permanent end of Welsh independence, but the Welsh would not accept their subjugation without further struggle. In 1294, a major rebellion broke out, led by Madog ap Llywelyn, who declared himself Prince of Wales and coordinated uprisings across the country. The rebellion achieved some initial successes, capturing several English castles and seriously threatening English control. Edward returned to Wales with another massive army and spent the winter of 1294 to 1295 campaigning in brutal conditions to suppress the uprising. The rebellion was eventually crushed and Madog captured, but the revolt demonstrated that Welsh national feeling remained strong and that the Welsh had not reconciled themselves to English rule. The most significant challenge to English dominion over Wales came at the beginning of the 15th century when Owain Glyndwr led what would be the last great Welsh War of Independence. Glyndwr was a member of the Welsh gentry who had been educated in England and served in the English army under both Richard II and the future Henry IV. He owned estates in northeastern Wales and seemed an unlikely revolutionary. However, a bitter land dispute with his English neighbour, Reginald Grey, Lord of Ruthin, escalated when the new King Henry IV, who had usurped the throne from Richard II in 1399, sided with Grey against Owain. The dispute might have remained a local matter, but in September 1400, Owain's supporters proclaimed him Prince of Wales, challenging both Grey's local authority and Henry's legitimacy as king. What began as a local quarrel quickly escalated into a national uprising. Owain attacked Grey's lands, burning the town of Ruthin, and then struck at English boroughs throughout northeastern Wales. The revolt spread rapidly as Welsh people from all social classes rallied to Owain's banner. The English response was hampered by the difficult Welsh terrain and weather conditions, with Henry's first expeditionary force achieving little beyond burning Welsh settlements and antagonising the population. In 1400, one Owain's cousins, the Tudor family, captured Conwy Castle in a daring raid, demonstrating that even Edward I's mighty fortresses were vulnerable. As the rebellion gained momentum, Owain attracted support from disaffected elements in England, including the Percy family, who had helped Henry gain the throne but now felt betrayed by the king. By 1404, Owain controlled most of Wales and was at the height of his power. He held a parliament at Machynlleth, where he laid out plans for an independent Welsh state, complete with Welsh universities and an independent Welsh church. French forces arrived to support the rebellion, as France sought to weaken England during the 100 Years' War. Owain formed alliances with Scottish nobles and English rebels contemplating a tripartite division of Britain that would restore Welsh independence. However, the tide began to turn against the Welsh after 1406. English forces recaptured key castles, including Harlech and Aberystwyth, and Owain's allies in England were defeated. The death of Owain's brother-in-law Edmund Mortimer during the Siege of Harlech in 1409 removed another important supporter. Owain himself was never captured or killed. He continued guerrilla resistance for several years, with his last documented military action occurring in 1412. After this, he simply disappeared, with his final fate remaining unknown. This mysterious end only enhanced his legendary status, and Owain Glyndwr became a powerful symbol of Welsh resistance and national identity, inspiring future generations of Welsh nationalists. The rebellion had devastating consequences for Wales. The fighting caused massive destruction, the economy was ruined, and trade came to a standstill. In the rebellion's aftermath, the English Parliament passed harsh penal laws restricting Welsh rights and imposing new disabilities on the Welsh people. These laws remained in force for decades, creating lasting bitterness and economic hardship. The political landscape of Wales would not fundamentally change again until the Tudor period. The Tudors were a Welsh family descended from Owain Glyndwr's ally, Tudor ap Goronwy, and when Henry Tudor defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485 to become Henry VII, many Welsh people celebrated the accession of a Welsh dynasty to the English throne. Henry VII rewarded Welsh supporters and appointed Welsh people to positions of authority, creating a more favourable environment for the Welsh gentry. However, it was Henry's son, Henry VIII, who would permanently transform the relationship between Wales and England through the Acts of Union passed between 1536 and 1543. The Acts of Union were driven by several factors. Thomas Cromwell. Henry VIII's chief minister saw the complex patchwork of jurisdictions in Wales, with the Principality governed under one system, and the Marcher lordships operating under their own laws as an impediment to effective royal government and tax collection. The establishment of royal supremacy over the Church of England in 1534 raised concerns that Wales might become a refuge for Catholics resistant to the religious changes. There were also fears that foreign Catholic powers might use the poorly defended Welsh coast as a landing point for an invasion of England. The Acts of Union addressed these concerns by abolishing the Marcher lordships and extending English law uniformly across all of Wales. Wales was reorganised into 13 counties on the English model, and Welsh representatives were granted seats in the English Parliament. The Acts had profound and lasting effects on Wales. They declared that Wales would be incorporated, united, and annexed with England, creating for the first time a legally unified state. English law replaced Welsh law in all matters, and English became the only language permitted for official purposes. The Acts specifically stated that anyone using the Welsh language would be ineligible for any official position within the realm. This language clause aimed at the complete Anglicisation of Wales and represented an existential threat to Welsh culture and identity. However, the impact of this provision was limited by practical realities. The vast majority of Welsh people spoke only Welsh, and English officials could not function without translators and intermediaries who could communicate with the Welsh-speaking population. Nevertheless, the subordination of the Welsh language to English in official contexts contributed to a long-term decline in the status of Welsh and the association of the language with poverty and backwardness. For the Welsh gentry, the Acts of Union represented an opportunity rather than a disaster. Ambitious Welsh landowners could now participate fully in English political and economic life, serving in Parliament, holding office, and advancing their families' fortunes. Many Welsh gentry families enthusiastically adopted English language and customs, seeing Anglicisation as the path to social and economic advancement. This created a growing divide between the Anglicised Welsh elite and the Welsh-speaking common people who maintained traditional language and culture. The following centuries would see the progressive consolidation of this two-tier society, with an English-speaking landowning class dominating a Welsh-speaking peasantry. For centuries after the Acts of Union, Wales remained a predominantly rural agricultural society, with most of the population engaged in farming, sheep raising, and small-scale industries. The Welsh economy operated on the margins of English commerce, with most Welsh people living in poverty by English standards. However, the 18th century would bring transformative changes as Wales became one of the cradles of the Industrial Revolution. The conjunction of abundant natural resources, particularly coal, iron ore and slate, with new technologies and expanding markets, would utterly transform Welsh society, creating an industrial landscape that would dominate Wales for nearly 2 centuries. The initial phase of industrialisation focused on iron production. The northern rim of the South Wales coalfield around Merthyr Tydfil emerged as Britain's foremost iron-producing district in the second half of the 18th century. In 1759, the Dowlais Iron Works was established, followed by the Plymouth Ironworks, Cyfarthfa Ironworks and Penydarren Ironworks. These massive industrial complexes represented the cutting edge of iron-making technology, employing thousands of workers and producing iron on a scale never before seen. Merthyr Tydfil transformed from a small village into the largest town in Wales and one of the most important industrial centres in the world. The ironworks required enormous quantities of coal to fire their blast furnaces, driving the expansion of coal mining throughout the region. The development of steam coal production for export marked the next phase of industrialisation. The Rhondda valleys proved particularly rich in high-quality steam coal, ideal for powering ships and locomotives. From the 1840s, coal mining spread rapidly through the valleys, with new pits opening constantly to meet insatiable demand. The construction of railways connecting the coalfields to ports at Cardiff, Newport and Swansea facilitated the export of Welsh coal to markets around the world. By the late 19th century, the South Wales coalfield had become the largest coal exporting region on Earth. In 1893, Cardiff became the world's principal coal port, handling millions of tons annually, and the Cardiff Coal Exchange set the global price for steam coal. At the industry's peak in 1913, over 230,000 men worked in 620 coal mines across South Wales, producing 57 million tonnes of coal annually. The coal industry transformed not just the Welsh economy, but Welsh society and landscape. The valleys filled with mining towns, characterised by rows of terraced houses, marching up hillsides, following the lines of the valleys. Massive spoil heaps accumulated near pit heads, reshaping the landscape, and streams ran black with coal dust. The population of mining districts exploded as workers flooded in from rural Wales, Ireland, England and beyond, seeking employment in the pits. Aberdare's population grew from 6,471 in 1841 to 32,299 just a decade later. The Rhondda's population increased from 3,035 in 1861 to 55,632 in 1881, eventually peaking at 162,729 in 1921. Working conditions in the mines were brutal and dangerous. Miners worked long hours in cramped, dark conditions, breathing coal dust that would eventually destroy their lungs with pneumoconiosis, commonly called black lung disease. Accidents were frequent and often catastrophic. In 1867, an explosion at Ferndale Colliery killed 178 men. The worst disaster in British mining history occurred at Senganydd near Caerphilly on October 14, 1913, when an explosion killed 439 miners and 1 rescuer. These tragedies were not aberrations, but regular occurrences that made mining one of the most dangerous occupations in industrial Britain. The coal industry created a distinctive working-class culture in the South Wales valleys. The danger and hardship of mining fostered strong solidarity among workers, leading to the development of powerful trade unions. The South Wales Miners' Federation, founded in 1898, became one of the most militant and effective unions in Britain, fighting for better wages, working conditions, and social reforms. The valleys also developed a rich cultural life, with male voice choirs becoming internationally famous and Welsh rugby emerging as a source of intense local pride. Nonconformist chapels, particularly Baptist and Methodist congregations, dominated religious and social life, providing education, welfare services, and moral guidance to their communities. Alongside coal mining, Wales developed other significant industries. The slate quarries of North Wales, particularly around Blaenau Festiniog and Bethesda, employed thousands of workers, and by the late 19th century, Wales supplied most of the world's roofing slate. The quarries created their own distinctive communities, with workers developing sophisticated skills in splitting and shaping slate, and creating a culture distinct from but parallel to that of the coal miners. In Swansea and the surrounding area, copper smelting became so dominant that the city earned the nickname Copperopolis. At its peak, Swansea smelted 90% of Britain's copper and much of the world's supply. Tin plate production emerged as another major industry, with Wales producing 75% of the world's tin plate by the late 19th century. The massive industrial development made Wales, by 1851, the world's first industrial society, meaning more people worked in industry than in agriculture. This transformation occurred with breathtaking speed, fundamentally altering Welsh life within a single generation. The shift from a predominantly Welsh-speaking agricultural society to an industrial one with large immigrant populations speaking various languages created profound social tensions. The arrival of English and Irish workers diluted Welsh culture in the industrial areas, and English increasingly became the language of commerce and industry, even as Welsh remained the language of home chapel and rural areas. The prosperity generated by industrialization was grossly unequal. Mine owners and industrialists accumulated enormous fortunes, while workers laboured in dangerous conditions for subsistence wages. The Marquis of Bute, who owned much of the land under which coal was found in Glamorganshire, became one of the wealthiest men in Britain through the development of Cardiff docks and the leasing of mineral rights. The Guest family owners of the Dowlais ironworks and other industrial dynasties built palatial mansions and wielded enormous economic and political power. Meanwhile, workers lived in cramped, unsanitary housing, with entire families often occupying single rooms. Life expectancy in industrial areas was significantly lower than in rural Wales or in middle-class urban areas, reflecting the terrible toll of industrial labour and poor living conditions. The early 20th century brought growing labour militancy as workers organised to improve their conditions. The Tony Pandy riots of 1910, when striking miners clashed with police sent in to break the strike, demonstrated the intensity of class conflict in the coalfields. The deployment of troops to suppress industrial unrest showed that the British government was prepared to use force to maintain order and protect property rights. World War I temporarily eased labour tensions as coal production became essential to the war effort, but it also radicalised many workers who questioned why they should fight for a country that treated them as expendable labour. The interwar period brought catastrophe to industrial Wales. The collapse of world trade during the Great Depression devastated the export-oriented Welsh economy. Coal mines closed en masse, throwing hundreds of thousands of men out of work. Unemployment rates in some valleys reached 70% or higher, creating scenes of desperate poverty that shocked contemporary observers. Between 1921 and 1939, approximately 400,000 people left Wales seeking work elsewhere in Britain or overseas. Entire communities were hollowed out as young people fled areas that offered no future. The poverty and suffering of this period left deep scars on the Welsh psyche and fueled support for the Labour Party, which had largely replaced the Liberals as the dominant political force in Wales. World War II brought renewed demand for coal, and Wales's industries revived somewhat during the war years. The nationalisation of coal mines in 1947 under the post-war Labour government was welcomed by many Welsh miners who hoped that state ownership would bring better conditions and more secure employment. However, the long-term decline of coal mining proved irreversible. Cheap imported coal competition from oil and natural gas and the gradual exhaustion of easily accessible seams led to progressive pit closures throughout the post-war decades. By 1981, only 34 mines remained operating in South Wales, producing less than 8 million tonnes annually, a fraction of the peak output. The miners' strike of 1984 to 1985 represented the last stand of the coal industry and of the mining communities that had defined South Wales for over a century. The strike pitted the National Union of Mine Workers against Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government in a bitter year-long struggle over pit closures. Welsh mining communities demonstrated extraordinary solidarity during the strike, with support networks organising food distribution and mutual aid to help families survive without wages. However, the miners were ultimately defeated, and the strike's failure accelerated the collapse of the industry. By the early 21st century, coal mining had virtually ceased in Wales, with only a handful of small operations remaining. The decline of traditional industries left Wales facing enormous challenges of economic restructuring. The South Wales valleys in particular suffered from unemployment, poverty and social problems, as communities built around mining struggled to find new sources of employment and identity. Government initiatives attempted to attract new industries with varying success, and there was a gradual shift towards service sector employment. Cardiff developed as a centre for government administration and financial services, while tourism became increasingly important, particularly in North Wales and coastal areas. However, the transition from industrial to post-industrial economy left many former mining communities behind, creating persistent pockets of deprivation and social problems. The 20th century also witnessed a remarkable revival of Welsh cultural and political identity. The decline of the Welsh language, which had seemed inevitable in the early 20th century, was arrested and then reversed through determined efforts to promote Welsh medium education and secure official status for the language. The Welsh Language Act of 1967 gave Welsh equal validity with English in Wales, and subsequent legislation strengthened these protections. The proportion of the population speaking Welsh, which had fallen to its lowest point in the 1960s, began to increase again, and Welsh medium schools became popular even among families without Welsh-speaking backgrounds. The language became a symbol of Welsh distinctiveness and national pride, transcending its earlier association with rural poverty. Welsh nationalism emerged as a significant political force with the formation of Plaid Cymru in 1925. Initially focused primarily on cultural and linguistic issues, Plaid Cymru gradually developed into a comprehensive political party advocating Welsh self-government. The investiture of Charles as Prince of Wales at Caernarfon Castle in 1969 sparked protests and demonstrations, highlighting growing discontent with Wales's subordinate status within the United Kingdom. Support for devolution, the transfer of certain governmental powers to a Welsh assembly, grew steadily, despite an initial referendum defeat in 1979. The breakthrough came in 1997, when a second referendum narrowly approved the creation of a National Assembly for Wales. The Assembly initially had limited powers focused on administering existing laws rather than making new ones, but it represented the first Welsh national governmental institution since the loss of independence in the 13th century. The Assembly's powers were gradually expanded through subsequent legislation, and in 2011, it gained primary lawmaking powers in devolved areas. In 2020, the Assembly was renamed Senedd Cymru, or the Welsh Parliament, further emphasising its status as a national legislature. Contemporary Wales exists in a state of complex identity, negotiating between its distinct national character and its incorporation within the United Kingdom. The nation remains economically challenged, with parts of Wales, particularly the former industrial areas, experiencing persistent poverty and unemployment rates above the UK average. However, Wales has also experienced cultural renaissance, with Welsh language television, radio and publishing thriving, and Welsh cultural expressions, from music to literature, gaining international recognition. The success of the Welsh national rugby team continues to provide occasions for collective celebration and national pride, while the preservation of Welsh musical traditions, from male voice choirs to contemporary Welsh language rock bands, maintains cultural continuity. The landscape of Wales still bears the marks of its industrial past, with the valleys showing the scars of mining alongside more recent attempts at environmental restoration. Heritage sites preserve the memory of Wales's industrial heritage, with places like Big Pit National Coal Museum, allowing visitors to descend into a former working mine and experience something of the conditions miners endured. The slate quarries of North Wales have been recognised as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, acknowledging their significance in the history of industrialisation. These memorials to Wales' industrial past serve both as tourist attractions and as reminders of the human cost of the economic development that transformed Wales. Wales today presents a paradox of a small nation with ancient roots and distinct identity operating within the political and economic framework of the United Kingdom, while asserting its own cultural and increasingly political distinctiveness. The tension between Welsh and British identity remains unresolved, with some Welsh people comfortable identifying primarily as British, others asserting a primarily Welsh identity, and many moving fluidly between these identities depending on context. The question of Wales's constitutional future, whether to remain part of the United Kingdom, seek greater devolution, or pursue outright independence, remains contested, with opinion divided along regional linguistic and generational lines. The COVID-19 pandemic brought these questions of national identity and governance into sharp focus, as the Welsh government pursued policies sometimes diverging from those implemented in England, demonstrating both the potential and the limitations of devolved government. The experience highlighted how Wales, while still dependent on the UK for many functions, has developed its own governmental capacity and political culture distinct from England. The future trajectory of Wales, whether toward greater integration with England, further autonomy, or eventual independence, remains uncertain, shaped by forces both internal and external to Wales itself. Looking back across the vast sweep of Welsh history from the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers to contemporary devolved government, certain patterns emerge. Wales has always occupied a position of geographical and cultural marginality in relation to centres of British power, yet this marginality has also fostered resilience and cultural distinctiveness. The Welsh have repeatedly demonstrated remarkable capacity for cultural survival, maintaining language tradition and identity through centuries of conquest, political subordination, and economic transformation. The very geography that made Wales difficult for outsiders to conquer has also sustained communities that preserve ways of life and cultural practices that have vanished elsewhere in Britain. The story of Wales is fundamentally a story of resistance and adaptation. Welsh people have resisted conquest, assimilation, and cultural extinction, while simultaneously adapting to changing circumstances and incorporating outside influences into a distinctly Welsh synthesis. The survival of the Welsh language, through centuries when its extinction seems certain, represents perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this story. A language that was officially suppressed and socially stigmatized has not only survived, but has experienced revival, becoming a symbol of national pride and cultural distinctiveness for Welsh people, regardless of whether they themselves speak it. The industrial transformation of Wales represented both catastrophe and opportunity. It destroyed traditional rural ways of life, created terrible poverty and suffering, and inflicted enormous environmental damage. Yet it also created new communities, forged powerful bonds of solidarity, and produced a distinctive working-class culture that has profoundly influenced Welsh identity. The chapels and choirs, the trade unions and rugby clubs, the political radicalism and commitment to education all emerged from the crucible of industrialisation. The decline of these industries has left Wales searching for new economic foundations while also grappling with the cultural legacy of the industrial era. Contemporary Wales faces the challenge of defining itself in a post-industrial age when traditional markers of Welsh identity no longer carry the same weight they once did. The decline of both the Welsh language in some areas and of the industrial communities that define South Wales for over a century has created uncertainty about what it means to be Welsh in the 21st century. Yet this is hardly the first time Wales has faced such questions. Throughout its history, Wales has repeatedly reinvented itself, maintaining core elements of identity while adapting to radically changed circumstances. The industrial transformation of Wales created not only economic and social changes, but also profoundly affected Welsh cultural life, and particularly the position of the Welsh language. At the beginning of the 19th century, Welsh was spoken by the overwhelming majority of the population, with English being confined largely to the gentry and border areas with England. However, industrialisation brought massive immigration of English and Irish speakers into the coalfields and industrial towns, diluting the proportion of Welsh speakers. More significantly, the association of Welsh with rural poverty and lack of economic opportunity led many Welsh parents to discourage their children from speaking, Welsh believing that English proficiency was essential for social advancement. The Education Act of 1870, which established compulsory elementary education throughout Britain, used English as the sole language of instruction. The infamous Welsh "not a wooden token" hung around the necks of children caught speaking Welsh in school became a symbol of educational policies designed to eradicate the language. Though the extent to which the Welsh "not" was actually used has been debated, its symbolic power in Welsh memory reflects the real pressure to abandon Welsh in favour of English. By the early 20th century, the Welsh language appeared to be in terminal decline. The proportion of Welsh speakers fell from nearly 90% of the population in the mid-19th century to less than 50% by 1911, and the decline seemed irreversible. The language was increasingly confined to rural areas, while the industrial South became predominantly English-speaking. Cultural commentators predicted the imminent death of Welsh, and many accepted this as an inevitable consequence of modernisation. However, a cultural and political movement emerged dedicated to preserving and promoting Welsh language and culture. The establishment of the University of Wales in 1893 created an institution where Welsh could be studied academically and where Welsh idiom higher education could develop. The National Eisteddfod, which had been revived in the early 19th century, became an annual festival celebrating Welsh language culture, bringing together poets, musicians and performers from across Wales and reinforcing the connection between Welsh identity and the Welsh language. The founding of Plaid Cymru, the Party of Wales, in 1925 marked the beginning of organised Welsh nationalism as a political force. Initially, Plaid Cymru focused primarily on cultural issues, particularly the preservation of the Welsh language and opposition to what its founders saw as the Anglicisation of Wales. The party's early leaders, including Saunders Lewis, a writer and academic, argued that Welsh national identity was inextricably bound to the Welsh language, and that the death of the language would mean the death of Wales as a distinct nation. This position proved controversial, even among Welsh people, many of whom, particularly in the industrial South, identified strongly as Welsh, despite speaking only English. The tension between linguistic nationalism that made the Welsh language central to Welsh identity and a more inclusive nationalism that embraced non-Welsh speakers would persist throughout the 20th century. Plaid Cymru remained a marginal force in Welsh politics for decades, winning its first parliamentary seat only in 1966, when Gwynfor Evans was elected in Carmarthen. However, the party's emphasis on Welsh cultural distinctiveness and its critique of the economic neglect of Wales by Westminster governments resonated with growing numbers of Welsh voters. The 1960s and 70s saw increasing Welsh nationalism manifesting in both constitutional politics and more radical direct action. The investiture of Prince Charles at Caernarfon Castle in 1969, intended by the British government as a celebration of the connection between Wales and the Crown, became instead an occasion for protests and demonstrations. Some Welsh nationalists viewed the ceremony as a humiliating reminder of conquest and subordination, and 2 members of a Welsh nationalist group were killed when a bomb they were carrying exploded prematurely on the eve of the investiture. The campaign for Welsh language rights achieved significant victories during this period. The Welsh Language Act of 1967 gave Welsh equal validity with English in Wales and required government departments and public bodies to provide services in Welsh where there was demand. This represented a fundamental shift from the previous policy of treating Welsh as at best a quaint survival and at worst an impediment to progress. The establishment of S4C, the Welsh language television channel in 1982, provided Welsh speakers with broadcasting in their own language for the first time. The creation of Welsh medium schools, where all subjects were taught through the medium of Welsh, transformed Welsh education. These schools proved popular not only with families from traditous, only Welsh-speaking areas, but also with English-speaking families who wanted their children to be bilingual. The success of Welsh medium education demonstrated that it was possible to reverse language decline through deliberate policy interventions. The cultural renaissance of the Welsh language extended beyond official policy to encompass grassroots movements and popular culture. Welsh language rock bands emerged in the 1980s and 90s, creating contemporary music in Welsh that appealed to young people. Artists like Dafydd Iwan combined political activism with musical performance, creating songs that became anthems of Welsh nationalism. The band Catatonia achieved mainstream success in the 1990s, bringing Welsh-accented English and occasional Welsh lyrics to international audiences. The poet and writer R.S. Thomas, though writing in English, explored themes of Welsh identity and the relationship between language land and spirituality in work that challenged comfortable assumptions about Welsh identity. His poetry often dwelt on the hardship of rural life and the apparent decline of traditional Welsh communities, yet found in this austere landscape sources of meaning and transcendence. The relationship between Welsh cultural revival and economic change created complex dynamics. As traditional industries collapsed and rural depopulation continued, the very communities that had been strongholds of Welsh language and culture faced existential challenges. Young people left rural areas seeking employment in cities where English predominated, leaving behind aging populations struggling to maintain Welsh language institutions. The rise of tourism in Welsh-speaking rural areas brought economic benefits, but also cultural tensions as holiday homes and retirement migration drove up property prices, making it difficult for local people, particularly young families, to remain in their communities. The second homes controversy became a flashpoint in the 1970s and 80s, with some Welsh nationalists burning holiday cottages owned by English people in protests against what they saw as the colonisation of Welsh communities. These conflicts reflected deeper anxieties about the survival of Welsh-speaking communities and cultures in the face of economic forces beyond local control. The irony that the very attractiveness of rural Wales, with its distinct language and culture, drew in outsiders whose presence threatened to destroy. That distinctiveness was not lost on observers. Solutions remained elusive, with attempts to restrict property ownership or require Welsh language proficiency for planning permission running up against both practical difficulties and concerns about discrimination. The problem highlighted the challenge of preserving minority language communities in modern market economies, where mobility and economic opportunity often pull against the maintenance of stable-rooted communities. The literary tradition in Wales, both in Welsh and English, flourished throughout the 20th century, despite, or perhaps because of the social and economic upheavals. The poet Dylan Thomas, though he spoke no Welsh, drew deeply on his Welsh background in his work, creating poetry and prose that captured something essential about Welsh life, even as it achieved international recognition. His play, Under Milk Wood, with its vivid portrayal of a small Welsh coastal town, became one of the most performed works in the English language. Thomas's complicated relationship with Wales, he left Wales for London and struggled with feeling trapped by provincial Welsh life, yet returned repeatedly to Welsh themes, reflected a broader ambivalence that many Welsh people felt about their homeland. Welsh language literature experienced its own renaissance with poets like Waldo Williams exploring themes of pacifism, community, and spiritual life in verse that combined traditional Welsh poetic forms with modernist sensibilities. The novelist Kate Roberts produced novels and short stories depicting the lives of working-class women in North Wales with unflinching honesty about poverty, hardship, and limited opportunities. Her work, written entirely in Welsh, reached relatively small audiences compared to English-language writers, but within Welsh language culture, she was revered as perhaps the greatest Welsh prose writer of the 20th century. The different trajectories of Welsh and English language writers from Wales reflected the broader bifurcation of Welsh culture into distinct, though sometimes overlapping streams. The 20th century also witnessed the development of distinctively Welsh political and social movements that emerged from the industrial working class experience. The Labour Party, which had replaced the Liberals as the dominant political force in Wales by the 1920s, built its support on the coal miners and steelworkers of industrial Wales. Welsh Labour politicians, including Aneurin Bevan, who as Minister of Health established the National Health Service in 1948, brought working-class Welsh perspectives to British politics. Bevan's vision of healthcare as a right, rather than a commodity available only to those who could afford it, drew on his experience growing up in Tredegar in the South Wales valleys, where poverty and inadequate medical care were endemic. The establishment of the NHS represented the high point of post-war social democracy, and for many Welsh people, validated the sacrifices of the industrial era by demonstrating that working-class political organisation could achieve fundamental social reforms. The political culture of industrial Wales combined militant trade unionism with a strong commitment to education and self-improvement. The miners' institutes that existed in almost every pit village provided libraries, reading rooms, and spaces for political discussion, creating a culture of working-class intellectualism that valued education as a means of both individual advancement and collective empowerment. The Workers' Educational Association organised classes in subjects ranging from economics to literature, bringing university-level education to working people who had left school at 14 to work in mines or factories. This combination of political radicalism and cultural aspiration produced a generation of self-educated working-class leaders who would play significant roles in British politics and trade unionism. The decline of these industries and the communities built around them represented not just economic loss, but cultural loss as well. The closure of mines meant the disappearance of not just jobs, but entire ways of life, the male voice choirs that had sung in competitions, the rugby clubs that had been sources of community pride, the chapels that had provided moral frameworks and social support networks. The physical decay of valley towns with boarded-up shops, abandoned churches, and deteriorating housing stock reflected the social decay that accompanied deindustrialization. Younger generations growing up in these communities often lacked the opportunities their grandparents had enjoyed despite all the hardships of mining life, creating a sense of abandonment and betrayal. Government attempts to regenerate former mining areas met with limited success. Some communities successfully reinvented themselves through tourism or light industry, but many struggled with persistent high unemployment and social problems, including drug abuse and family breakdown. The Objective 1 funding that parts of Wales received from the European Union, recognising them as among the poorest regions in Western Europe, brought investment in infrastructure and training programmes, but could not fully compensate for the loss of the industrial base that had supported these communities for over a century. The question of what would replace the coal industry as the foundation of the Welsh economy remained only partially answered, with service sector employment offering lower wages and less secure than the industrial jobs that had disappeared. The development of Cardiff as a capital city for Wales represented an important symbolic and practical development in the evolution of Welsh national identity. Cardiff had grown from a small town to a major city during the industrial era based on its role as a coal-exporting port. The decision to make Cardiff the official capital of Wales in 1955 recognised its status as the largest Welsh city and its central location. The construction of government buildings in Cardiff to house first the Welsh Office and later the National Assembly, and subsequently the Senedd, created physical expressions of Welsh governmental institutions. The redevelopment of Cardiff Bay, transforming derelict docklands into a modern waterfront district with cultural venues, government buildings and commerce, developments symbolise both the decline of industrial Wales and aspirations for a post-industrial future. The creation of national Welsh institutions extended beyond government to encompass cultural and sporting organisations. The National Museum of Wales, the National Library of Wales, and later the Welsh Books Council and Literature Wales provided infrastructure for preserving and promoting Welsh culture. The reorganisation of the Welsh Rugby Union and the success of the national team, particularly during periods when Wales dominated the Five Nations Championship, provided occasions for collective celebration of Welsh identity that transcended political and linguistic divisions. Rugby in particular became a crucial element of modern Welsh identity, offering a form of national expression that united Welsh speakers and non-Welsh speakers, industrial South Wales and rural North Wales, in shared support for the national team. The success of the 1997 devolution referendum, though achieved by the narrowest of margins, opened a new chapter in Welsh political history. The vote split along regional and linguistic lines, with Welsh-speaking areas in the north and west voting strongly in favour, while much of the industrial south remained sceptical. The final result showed just over 50% in favour, with a majority of only 7,000 votes out of over 1 million cast, demonstrating how divided Welsh opinion remained about self-government. Nevertheless, the creation of the National Assembly for Wales represented a fundamental constitutional change, establishing for the first time since the conquest a Welsh national governmental institution with democratic legitimacy. The early years of the Assembly were marked by uncertainty about its powers and role. Initial restrictions limited it to administering existing laws, rather than creating new ones, leading to criticism that it was merely an expensive talking shop. However, over time the Assembly gained increasing powers through successive Government of Wales Acts. The move to primary lawmaking powers in 2011 transformed the Assembly from an administrative body into a true legislature capable of making laws for Wales in devolved areas. The decision to rename the body Senedd Cymru, or Welsh Parliament, in 2020 reflected its evolving status and aspirations to be recognised as more than merely an assembly, but as a genuine national parliament. The devolved government pursued policies that diverged from those implemented in England, demonstrating the potential for Wales to take different approaches to public policy. The decision not to introduce university tuition fees in Wales, the provision of free prescriptions for all the different approach to school examinations and curriculum, all illustrated how devolution allowed policies tailored to Welsh circumstances and values. The response to the COVID-19 pandemic, with the Welsh Government implementing different restrictions and public health measures than those in England, brought the significance of devolution into sharp focus for many Welsh people who had previously paid little attention to the powers and responsibilities of Welsh institutions. The question of Wales's constitutional future remains contested and uncertain. Support for Welsh independence has grown particularly among younger voters, and in the wake of Brexit, which saw Wales vote narrowly to leave the European Union, despite the significant economic benefits Wales had received from EU membership. However, polling consistently shows that independence supporters remain a minority, with most Welsh people favouring either the current devolved arrangement or potentially greater devolution of powers. The debate about independence reflects deeper questions about Welsh identity and Wales's place in the United Kingdom and the wider world. The impact of Brexit on Wales has been complex and sometimes contradictory. The vote to leave the European Union, particularly strong in former industrial areas of South Wales, seemed to reflect both economic grievances and cultural anxieties about immigration and change. The irony that Wales had been a net beneficiary of EU funding, receiving far more from Brussels than it contributed, did not prevent a majority voting to leave. The loss of EU structural funds and the potential economic impacts of leaving the single market and customs union created significant concerns about Wales's economic future. The fact that Wales had no voice in the Brexit negotiations and that Welsh interests were largely subordinated to broader UK priorities highlighted the limitations of devolution and fueled arguments for either greater autonomy or independence. The Welsh language continues to be central to debates about Welsh identity and the future of Wales. The 2011 census showed that 19% of the population could speak Welsh, a slight increase from previous decades, and the first reversal of the long-term decline. The Welsh government set ambitious targets to increase the number of Welsh speakers to 1 million by 2050, representing a dramatic expansion of the language. Whether these targets are achievable remains debated, but they reflect a political commitment to Welsh as a living language rather than a museum piece. The growth of Welsh medium education, the expansion of Welsh language broadcasting, and the increasing use of Welsh in public life all suggest that the language has stabilised and may even be growing in certain areas. However, significant challenges remain. The geographical distribution of Welsh speakers continues to show a stark divide between Welsh-speaking areas in the north and west and predominantly English-speaking areas in the south and east. Many young people from Welsh-speaking communities move to English-speaking cities for education and employment, threatening the sustainability of traditional Welsh-speaking communities. The question of whether Welsh can become a truly modern urban language used in all domains of life, or whether it will remain primarily the language of rural areas and cultural activities, remains unresolved. The success of Welsh language social media and the adoption of Welsh by young people who use it in informal contexts alongside English provides grounds for optimism. The position of Wales within the United Kingdom faces challenges from multiple directions. The rise of Scottish nationalism and the possibility of Scottish independence raises questions about the viability of the remaining union between England and Wales. Northern Ireland's troubled status and the impact of Brexit on the Irish border create additional strains on the UK constitutional structure. England's demographic and economic dominance within the Union means that English interests inevitably take precedence in UK-wide decision-making, creating ongoing frustrations for Wales and other smaller nations. The lack of a coherent constitutional framework for the United Kingdom, with devolution having been implemented asymmetrically and without systematic thought to how the different parts of the UK relate to each other, creates ongoing uncertainties. The economic challenges facing Wales remain daunting. The transition from industrial to service economy has left parts of Wales, particularly the former mining areas, with high unemployment and persistent poverty. Welsh GDP per capita remains significantly below the UK average and well below that of prosperous regions of England. The reliance on public sector employment makes Wales vulnerable to government spending cuts, while the lack of a strong private sector base limits opportunities for economic growth. Attempts to attract investment through enterprise zones and business incentives have had mixed results, with companies sometimes taking advantage of subsidies before relocating once support ends. Tourism has emerged as an increasingly important part of the Welsh economy, with millions of visitors coming to Wales annually, attracted by its natural beauty, historic sites, and cultural offerings. The designation of the Blaenavon industrial landscape as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognition of the slate quarries of northwest Wales, and the promotion of Wales as an adventure tourism destination all contribute to a growing tourism sector. However, tourism tends to create relatively low-paid seasonal employment and can create tensions in communities struggling with second homes and holiday lets, that drive up housing costs for local residents. The challenge is to develop a tourism sector that benefits local communities, rather than merely extracting value from Welsh landscapes and culture for the benefit of external investors. The Welsh cultural sector has demonstrated remarkable vitality despite economic challenges. Welsh literature, both in Welsh and English, continues to produce work of international significance. Niall Griffiths, Rachel Trezise, and other contemporary writers explore themes of post-industrial decline, identity, and belonging in work that captures something essential about contemporary Wales. Welsh language writers including Lywyd Owen and Manon Steffan Ross continued literary traditions in Welsh while engaging with modern themes and contemporary concerns. The National Eisteddfod remains a major annual festival, attracting tens of thousands of participants and spectators, demonstrating the continuing vitality of Welsh language culture. Welsh music encompasses an extraordinary range from traditional folk music and male voice choirs to contemporary rock pop and electronic music. The Manic Street Preachers, emerging from Blackwood in the South Wales valleys, achieved international success while explicitly engaging with Welsh themes and history in their lyrics. The Super Furry Animals sang in both Welsh and English, creating music that bridged linguistic divides while celebrating Welsh distinctiveness. Contemporary artists, including Cerys Matthews, continue to bring Welsh perspectives and sensibilities to wider audiences. The success of these artists demonstrates that Welsh culture can achieve commercial success and critical recognition without abandoning its distinctiveness. The arts infrastructure in Wales has developed significantly, with institutions like the Wales Millennium Centre in Cardiff providing world-class venues for performance. The National Theatre Wales, founded in 2010, operates without a permanent building, instead creating site-specific performances throughout Wales, bringing theatre to communities that might otherwise have limited access to professional productions. The support for the arts through the Arts Council of Wales and Welsh Government funding, though often inadequate, provides a framework for cultural production that recognises the arts as essential to Welsh life rather than merely entertainment. Sport, particularly rugby, continues to play a central role in Welsh national life. The Millennium Stadium now, the Principality Stadium in Cardiff, provides a magnificent venue for international matches and other major events. The success or failure of the national rugby team has an impact on national mood that would seem disproportionate if sport were merely a game. Rugby provides one of the few arenas where Wales can compete on equal terms with larger nations, and victories, particularly over England, carry symbolic weight far beyond the merely sporting. The singing of the Welsh national anthem, May Hen Wlad Fai Na Daw, at rugby, matches with 70,000 voices raised together, represents a powerful expression of collective Welsh identity. Football, which had long been overshadowed by rugby in Wales, has experienced a renaissance with the Welsh national team qualifying for major tournaments, including Euro 2016, where they reached the semi-finals. The success of individual Welsh footballers like Gareth Bale in the international game has raised the profile of Welsh football and created new sources of national pride. The construction of new football stadia and the development of Welsh football leagues has created infrastructure supporting the sport at all levels. The fact that both rugby and football can serve as vehicles for Welsh national expression demonstrates the flexibility of Welsh identity and its ability to incorporate different cultural forms. The educational landscape in Wales has evolved significantly, with Welsh universities playing important roles in both education and research. Cardiff University, Swansea University, and other Welsh institutions attract students from across the world while also serving Welsh students. The expansion of higher education has created opportunities for young Welsh people that previous generations lacked, though the introduction of tuition fees and student debt has created new barriers to access. The emphasis on Welsh history, language, and culture in the Welsh education curriculum reflects a determination to ensure that young people growing up in Wales understand Welsh distinctiveness and have the opportunity to engage with Welsh culture regardless of their family background. The digital revolution has created both opportunities and challenges for Wales. The development of high-speed internet infrastructure has the potential to reduce geographical isolation and allow businesses and individuals in rural Wales to connect to global markets and networks. However, the slow rollout of broadband to rural areas has created digital divides that mirror and reinforce existing economic inequalities. The rise of social media has created new spaces for Welsh language use, with young people using Welsh on platforms like Twitter, Instagram and TikTok, creating contemporary Welsh language content that reaches audiences far beyond traditional Welsh-speaking areas. The digitisation of Welsh cultural materials, through projects like the Welsh National Library's Digital Archive, has made historical sources accessible to researchers and the public, creating new opportunities for engagement with Welsh history and culture. Environmental concerns have become increasingly central to political discourse in Wales as elsewhere. The legacy of industrial pollution from coal mining and metal smelting has created significant environmental remediation challenges, with contaminated land and polluted watercourses requiring costly cleanup efforts. Climate change poses particular threats to Wales, with its long coastline vulnerable to rising sea levels and increased storm intensity, while changes in rainfall patterns threaten agriculture and water management. The development of renewable energy, particularly wind power, has created controversy, with large wind farms in rural areas, generating opposition from communities concerned about visual impact and environmental effects, even as they provide clean energy. The tension between economic development and environmental protection plays out repeatedly in planning disputes and policy debates. The Welsh landscape itself remains central to Welsh identity, with the mountains of Snowdonia, the valleys of South Wales, the Pembrokeshire coastline, and the wild moorlands of the Brecon Beacons, all contributing to a sense of place that defines Welsh distinctiveness. The designation of large areas of Wales as national parks and areas of outstanding natural beauty reflects recognition of the landscape's value, though it also creates restrictions on development that can frustrate local communities seeking economic opportunities. The relationship between Welsh people and the land has deep historical roots, stretching back through generations of farming and rural life to the prehistoric peoples who left their stone monuments scattered across the landscape. This connection to place remains powerful even for urban Welsh people, who may rarely visit rural areas, but who identify strongly with Wales as a specific geographical and cultural space. The Welsh diaspora scattered across the world maintains connections to Wales and contributes to the dissemination of Welsh culture internationally. Welsh communities in Patagonia, established in the 19th century by Welsh colonists seeking to create a Welsh-speaking settlement, free from English interference, maintain Welsh language and cultural traditions to this day. Welsh societies in North America, Australia, and other destinations where Welsh emigrants settled keep alive connections to the homeland even among people whose families left Wales generations ago. These diaspora communities demonstrate the portability of Welsh identity and its ability to survive transplantation to radically different environments. The annual celebration of St. David's Day on March 1st by Welsh people around the world provides an occasion for asserting Welsh identity and maintaining connections to Wales, regardless of where Welsh people happen to live. The relationship between Wales and England remains fundamental to understanding contemporary Wales. The geographical proximity, economic integration, and centuries of political union have created deep connections and interdependencies that cannot easily be severed. Many Welsh people have family connections across the border, work in England, or have English connections through marriage or education. The border between Wales and England, though clearly marked, is highly permeable, with people, goods, and ideas flowing freely across it. This integration creates both opportunities and challenges, making Wales economically dependent on England, while also exposing Welsh culture and identity to English influence. The asymmetry of power within this relationship, with England's population 10 times that of Wales, means that Welsh interests can easily be overlooked or subordinated to English priorities, creating ongoing resentment and frustration. Yet Wales has demonstrated repeatedly throughout its history that it can maintain distinct identity and culture, even while deeply integrated with larger polities. The survival of the Welsh language through centuries when its suppression was official policy, the maintenance of distinct cultural traditions through industrialisation, and the creation of Welsh governmental institutions within the framework of the United Kingdom all testify to Welsh resilience and adaptability. The challenge facing contemporary Wales is to build on this resilience while addressing the economic, social and cultural challenges of the 21st century. Whether Wales's future lies in greater autonomy within the UK independence or some other constitutional arrangement remains to be determined. What seems certain is that Wales will continue to evolve while maintaining those core elements of identity, language, connection to place and cultural distinctiveness that have characterised Wales throughout its long history. The Welsh capacity for cultural reinvention while maintaining continuity with the past suggests that Wales will continue to evolve in ways that honour its history while engaging with contemporary challenges. The revival of the Welsh language, the development of distinct Welsh political institutions, and the continued vitality of Welsh cultural expression all indicate that Welsh identity remains vibrant and meaningful to many people. Whether Wales remains within the United Kingdom, seeks independence, or finds some intermediate constitutional arrangement, its distinct identity, forged over millennia of history, seems likely to endure. The question is not whether Wales will survive as a distinct entity, but what form that distinctiveness will take and how it will be expressed in coming decades and centuries. The history of the Welsh ultimately reminds us that national identities are not fixed essences, but evolving constructions shaped by geography, politics, economy and culture. Wales has been many things over the millennia: a land of Celtic tribes, a Roman military zone, a collection of medieval kingdoms, a conquered principality, an industrial powerhouse, and now a devolved nation within the United Kingdom. Through all these transformations, certain threads persist: the Welsh language or its memory, even among non-speakers, a connection to place a sense of distinct identity, separate from England, and a remarkable cultural resilience. These elements have combined in different configurations across the centuries, but they remain the foundation of what it means to be Welsh, providing continuity even as everything else changes. As Wales moves further into the 21st century, it carries with it this long, complex history. The prehistoric burial chambers still crown Welsh hilltops, silent witnesses to communities that lived and died millennia ago. The massive medieval castles dominate town centres, reminders of conquest, but also now symbols of Welsh identity and heritage, transformed from instruments of oppression into tourist attractions and sources of pride. The industrial heritage shapes valley landscapes, with pit-head winding gear preserved as monuments, and former mines converted into museums telling the story of the men who worked and died, extracting coal from beneath the Welsh mountains. The contemporary institutions of devolved government housed in modern buildings in Cardiff Bay create new possibilities for our Welsh self-determination, while the continued vitality of Welsh language culture ensures that the most distinctive marker of Welsh identity survives into the future. All these layers of history coexist in the Welsh landscape and Welsh consciousness, creating a palimpsest where past and present intermingle, and where each generation must negotiate its relationship with an inheritance that is simultaneously burden and gift. The weight of history can be oppressive, creating nostalgia for imagined golden ages or resentment at historical injustices. Yet history also provides resources for understanding the present and imagining future's resources of language, culture, tradition, and shared memory that can be drawn upon to create meaning and identity. The story of Wales is far from over, and future chapters will undoubtedly bring new challenges and transformations that we cannot now predict. Climate change, economic restructuring, technological revolution, demographic shifts all will reshape Wales in ways that will require yet another reinvention of what it means to be Welsh. Yet the persistence of Welsh identity through conquest, industrialisation, economic crisis, social change, and cultural transformation suggests that whatever form Wales takes in the future, it will remain distinctly Welsh. The connection to the land, to language, to cultural traditions, and to a shared sense of history However contested and complex that history may be, will continue to provide foundations for Welsh identity. Whether future generations of Welsh people speak Welsh or not, whether they live in Wales or in diaspora communities around the world, whether Wales is an independent part of a reformed United Kingdom or absorbed into some larger European or global structure, the sense of being Welsh, of coming from this specific place, with its particular history and culture, will endure. This is the true legacy of the thousands of years of history recounted here, the creation of an identity sufficiently robust to survive radical transformations, yet sufficiently flexible to adapt to circumstances that previous generations could never have imagined. The story of Wales continues, and those who will write its future chapters are already among us, shaped by this history and preparing to add their own contributions to the long tale of the Welsh people.